On January 23, 2004, the Office of the Secretary of State received a letter from the Ministry of Defense. The letter was 34 pages long. It was typed on official ministry paper. It carried the official seal. The letter was addressed to the Secretary of State for Defense. The letter outlined in meticulous detail the reasons why the SAS needed to stand down from operations in Northern Ireland. The letter was signed by the Permanent Secretary of the MOD. The letter explained the situation. The letter made recommendations. The letter laid out options, but there was no return letter. There was no written reply. There was no acknowledgment. The silence from the Secretary of State's office was not accidental. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice. It was a way of saying that the letter had not been received, or more precisely, that it had been received but did not require a response. The SAS stood down anyway. The operation continued to diminish. The presence in Northern Ireland faded. The letter came at a moment when the political situation in Northern Ireland was shifting fundamentally. The Good Friday Agreement had been in place for 6 years. The paramilitary ceasefires had largely held, though tensions remained. The violence had reduced dramatically from the levels of the 1990s. The political process was moving forward, though slowly. Power sharing was being established, though difficult negotiations continued. The security situation was improving, though threats remained. In this context, the continued presence of the SAS in Northern Ireland seemed increasingly anachronistic. It seemed like an artifact of a conflict that was ending rather than a response to a conflict that was ongoing. But the formal end of the SAS operation in Northern Ireland was complicated by institutional factors. The military wanted to close the operation and redeploy resources. The police wanted to maintain some capacity for specialized operations. The politicians wanted to maintain the symbol of security, even if the actual threat had diminished. And so the SAS remained, operating in a reduced capacity, maintaining a presence that was becoming more political than military. The letter from the Ministry of Defense addressed these issues directly and comprehensively. The letter explained that the security situation had changed materially. The letter provided detailed analysis of threat indicators. The letter provided assessment of the current activities of Republican paramilitaries. The letter provided assessment of loyalist paramilitary activities. The letter provided analysis of emerging threats. The letter explained that the threat had diminished significantly from what it had been in the 1990s. The letter explained that the presence of the SAS was no longer justified by the level of threat. The letter provided detailed cost analysis. The letter explained that the continued presence of the SAS in Northern Ireland was consuming resources that could be deployed elsewhere. The letter explained that the SAS regiments were needed for other operations that were becoming increasingly significant in the post-9/11 world. The letter explained all of this in careful language, with full respect for the authority of the civilian leadership. But it also explained clearly that the military assessment was that the SAS needed to stand down. The letter recommended that the operation should be concluded. The letter provided timeline recommendations. The letter provided phasing recommendations. But the letter never received a response. Not a formal response. Not an informal response. Nothing. The Secretary of State did not write a letter back. The Secretary of State did not call for a meeting. The Secretary of State did not request clarification. The Secretary of State did not request additional analysis. The Secretary of State simply did not respond. It was as if the letter had not arrived, or as if the letter contained no question that required an answer. The silence was complete. It continued for weeks. It continued for months, and during that time, the SAS quietly began the process of standing down from operations in Northern Ireland. The withdrawal was gradual, it was careful, it did not attract attention, it did not generate headlines. It simply happened, and by the time the political leadership finally acknowledged that something had changed, the SAS was already gone. The operation in Northern Ireland had been one of the longest continuous operations in SAS history. It had begun in the early 1970s, in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday and the escalation of violence that followed. The SAS had been inserted into the conflict as a counter-terrorism force. They had been given a mandate to hunt down members of the Irish Republican Army who were planning and executing attacks. The operation had run for more than 30 years. Over that period, the SAS had conducted hundreds of operations. They had participated in firefights with armed terrorists. They had conducted surveillance operations. They had gathered intelligence. They had worked with the police and with other military units. They had been integral to the security effort in Northern Ireland. They had lost personnel. They had achieved results. But by 2004, the situation had changed fundamentally. The peace process was holding, though fragile. The violence had not ended completely, but it had been dramatically reduced. The IRA was not engaged in the same level of activity that it had been engaged in during the 1980s and 1990s. The threat was still there. The threat was real, but it was lower. It was different. It was dispersed. The presence of the SAS was still valued, but perhaps not as much as it had been. The question was whether the military should maintain its commitment to the operation or whether it should redeploy its resources. The Ministry of Defense had decided that redeployment was necessary. The letter to the Secretary of State explained this logic in exhaustive detail. The letter laid out the case methodically, page after page. The letter explained that the security environment in Northern Ireland had changed. The letter provided statistics on the level of violence. The letter provided comparison of violence statistics from different time periods. The letter provided assessment of the current threat from Republican paramilitaries. The letter provided specific assessment of the threat from the IRA. The letter provided assessment of the threat from splinter groups. The letter provided assessment of loyalist paramilitary activities. The letter provided analysis of the intelligence picture. The letter provided evaluation of the effectiveness of the SAS operation and the costs associated with maintaining it. The letter provided detailed financial analysis. The letter provided manpower analysis. The letter provided argument that the continued presence of the SAS was not justified by the level of threat. The letter provided recommendation that the operation should be concluded. The letter provided multiple timeline options. The letter provided phasing recommendations. The letter was professional. The letter was thorough. The letter was comprehensive. The letter was presented with all appropriate respect for the authority of the civilian leadership, but it was also a request that something be done. It was a request that the Secretary of State make a decision. The Secretary of State did not respond to the letter. This meant that the letter was never formally acknowledged. This meant that there was no written record of the government's decision on the question raised by the letter. This meant that the civilian leadership never formally responded to the military recommendation. But it also meant that the military was free to proceed with the withdrawal. It meant that the SAS could stand down from operations without waiting for explicit authorization. It meant that the operation could be concluded based on military judgment rather than on explicit political decision. The silence from the Secretary of State was a form of authorization. It was authorization by omission. It was authorization through inaction. The SAS withdrawal from Northern Ireland was managed carefully by military planners. It was not announced. There were no press releases. There were no official statements. The operation simply wound down. Personnel were transferred to other units. Equipment was relocated. Facilities were closed. Intelligence networks were wound down. Liaison arrangements were terminated. By the time the political leadership realized that something had changed, the withdrawal was essentially complete. The SAS was no longer operating in Northern Ireland. The operation had been concluded. The decision had been implemented by the military without explicit authorization from the civilian leadership, but with implicit authorization by the civilian leadership's failure to respond to the letter requesting that the operation be concluded. The significance of this pattern is that it represents a way in which military organizations exercise authority within the formal structure of civilian control. The military cannot explicitly order the civilian leadership to make a decision, but the military can present the civilian leadership with a decision that the military has made, and then implement that decision unless the civilian leadership explicitly prevents it. The military can frame a request as a recommendation. The military can explain the reasoning. The military can present the analysis, and then the military can proceed unless the civilian leadership says no. If the civilian leadership does not say no, the military proceeds. If the civilian leadership is silent, the military proceeds. This is different from direct disobedience. This is not a coup. This is not a military takeover. This is a sophisticated exercise of authority by military professionals who understood how to work within the system of civilian control while still achieving what the military believed needed to be done, and it worked perfectly. The operation was concluded, the decision was implemented, and the civilian leadership either approved of the outcome or was simply too busy to notice that anything had changed. The military achieved its objectives. The letter from the Ministry of Defense was written with the clear understanding that it might not receive a response. The letter was written with the understanding that in the British political system, not all matters require formal written responses. The letter was written with the understanding that the civilian leadership might be occupied with other matters. The letter was written with the understanding that silence could be interpreted as acceptance. The letter was written in a way that made it clear what the military wanted to do. The letter was written in a way that explained the reasoning thoroughly. The letter was written in a way that respected the authority of the civilian leadership. But the letter was also written with the understanding that the military would proceed if the civilian leadership did not respond. This is a form of authority. It is not explicit authority. It is not formal authority. It is implicit authority. It is the authority that comes from being able to make decisions and implement them unless explicitly prevented from doing so. The question that haunts this kind of arrangement is whether it represents a healthy balance of power or whether it represents a subtle erosion of civilian control of the military. On one hand, it can be argued that the military is acting appropriately. The military is making a professional judgment about what needs to be done. The military is presenting that judgment to the civilian leadership. The military is explaining the reasoning thoroughly, and the military is implementing the decision unless explicitly prevented from doing so. This respects the authority of the civilian leadership while also allowing the military to act on its professional judgment. It allows for pragmatic decision-making. It allows for operations to be conducted efficiently. On the other hand, it can be argued that this arrangement allows the military to effectively make decisions that should be made by the civilian leadership. The military decides what it wants to do. The military presents that decision to the civilian leadership in a way that seems to be a request. The military implements the decision unless explicitly prevented. If the civilian leadership is busy or inattentive or simply does not know how to respond to the military's request, the military gets what it wants. The military's action is implemented, and it becomes harder for the civilian leadership to reverse the action after the fact. The civilian leadership loses control of the military through a process of gradual erosion rather than through any dramatic challenge. In the case of the SAS withdrawal from Northern Ireland, the outcome was probably beneficial. The security situation did not deteriorate as a result of the withdrawal. The police forces in Northern Ireland did not find themselves unable to respond to threats because the SAS was gone. The police did not request that the SAS return. The political process continued. The peace was maintained. The withdrawal was handled professionally, but the process by which the decision was made was not a model of civilian control of the military. The decision was made by the military. The military requested permission. The civilian leadership did not respond. The military proceeded, and the operation was concluded without formal civilian decision. This is the way the system actually works, even though it is not the way the system is supposed to work according to constitutional theory. The letter from the Ministry of Defense was filed in official archives. It was marked as classified. Access to it is restricted. It is not a document that the general public has seen. It is not a document that is widely known, but it exists. It is a record of a military recommendation that was presented to civilian leadership. It is a record of a decision that was made by the military organization. It is a record of the way that the military can exercise authority, even within a system that is supposed to be subject to civilian control. The absence of a response to the letter is itself significant. The silence of the Secretary of State is itself a form of communication. It is a form of authorization. It is a way of saying that the military can proceed. It is a way of saying that the civilian leadership is not going to intervene. It is a way of saying that the military's judgment is acceptable, or at least that the civilian leadership is not going to prevent the military from acting on its judgment. This is different from explicit authorization, but it is also different from explicit prohibition. It is authorization by omission. It is the kind of authorization that is most useful to military organizations because it is deniable. If questions were raised later about whether the withdrawal had been properly authorized, the Secretary of State could say many things. The Secretary of State could say that the letter was received but did not require a response. The Secretary of State could say that the military had the authority to make decisions about its own operations. The Secretary of State could say that the decision was made by the military in its professional capacity, but the Secretary of State never had to formally authorize the withdrawal. The withdrawal was authorized by silence. It was authorized by inattention. It was authorized by the failure of the civilian leadership to pay attention to what the military was doing. This is how military organizations maintain authority even within systems that are supposed to be subject to civilian control. This is how military professionals make decisions that are supposed to be made by civilians. This is how military authority expands into areas that are supposed to be under civilian control, not through coups, not through explicit challenges to civilian authority, but through the careful use of requests and recommendations and implicit authorization and silence. The military asks, the civilian leadership is silent, the military proceeds, and the power of the civilian leadership to control the military erodes gradually, without drama, without explicit challenge, without any event that can be pointed to as the moment when civilian control was lost. The letter from the Ministry of Defense was one example of this pattern. It was a letter that made a recommendation. It was a letter that explained the reasoning in exhaustive detail. It was a letter that was addressed to the appropriate civilian authority. But it was also a letter that made clear what the military was going to do, regardless of whether the civilian authority responded. It was a letter that set in motion events that would occur whether or not the civilian authority approved. It was a letter that exercised military authority within the system of civilian control, and the absence of a response from the Secretary of State was a form of authorization. It was authorization for the military to proceed with the withdrawal. It was authorization for the operation in Northern Ireland to come to an end. It was authorization by silence. Within 6 months of the letter being sent, the SAS was no longer operating in Northern Ireland. The operation had been concluded, the personnel had been transferred, the equipment had been relocated, the intelligence networks had been closed down. The 30-year presence of the SAS in Northern Ireland had come to an end. It came to an end without dramatic announcement. It came to an end without formal political decision by elected officials. It came to an end because the military had decided that it was time for the operation to end, had presented that decision to the civilian leadership, and had proceeded when the civilian leadership did not respond. What this pattern reveals is something about the actual structure of power within the British state. The formal structure suggests that the military takes orders from the civilian leadership. The actual structure is more complicated. The military makes recommendations. The civilian leadership makes decisions. But sometimes the civilian leadership does not make decisions. Sometimes the civilian leadership is silent. And when the civilian leadership is silent, the military proceeds. The silence is interpreted as authorization. The British system of government is based on parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament is sovereign. The government serves Parliament. The military serves the government. The chain of command is clear, but the actual practice is more fluid. The military makes decisions about many matters without explicit authorization from the civilian leadership. The military decides when to deploy resources. The military decides when to withdraw resources. The military decides when to conduct operations. The military decides when to conclude operations. The civilian leadership approves these decisions sometimes, but sometimes the civilian leadership simply accepts the decisions that the military has made. In the case of the SAS withdrawal from Northern Ireland, the civilian leadership accepted the military decision. Or perhaps the civilian leadership never even realized that a decision had been made. The letter was sent, the letter was received, the letter sat unanswered, and the military proceeded with the withdrawal. The operation was concluded, the personnel were transferred, the equipment was relocated, and the civilian leadership discovered after the fact that something had changed. Or perhaps the civilian leadership knew all along that something was changing, but chose not to formally respond to it. The strategic significance of the withdrawal is that it freed up SAS personnel for deployment to other theaters. After 2004, those SAS personnel were increasingly deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. The resources that had been committed to Northern Ireland for over 30 years were redirected to the post-9/11 conflicts. The military had identified where it believed its resources needed to be deployed. The military had presented its assessment to the civilian leadership. The military had received no response, and the military had proceeded with the redeployment. The political significance of the withdrawal is that it marked a transition in the British approach to Northern Ireland. The peace process was holding. The security situation was improving. The need for military counter-terrorism operations was diminishing. The political process was becoming more important than military operations. conditions. The SAS represented a form of security that was based on military force. As the political situation changed, military force became less relevant. The SAS withdrawal reflected this change. It reflected the military's assessment that military force was no longer the appropriate instrument for managing the security situation in Northern Ireland. The constitutional significance of the withdrawal is more troubling. A major military operation was concluded without explicit authorization from the civilian leadership. A 30-year military presence was ended without formal political decision. A redeployment of significant military resources was implemented without explicit civilian approval. The military made a recommendation. The civilian leadership did not respond. The military proceeded. This is a way of exercising authority that is not explicitly provided for in the Constitution or in standard accounts of the relationship between civil and military power. The letter from the Ministry of Defence was not the first such letter, and it would not be the last. This is a pattern that emerges from the actual practice of governance in the British state. When the military wants to do something, the military makes a case for it. When the civilian leadership does not respond, the military interprets silence as authorization. The military proceeds. The action is taken, and by the time the civilian leadership realizes what has happened, the action is complete. The civilian leadership can then choose to reverse the action, but reversing an action is more difficult than preventing it in the first place. So the civilian leadership often accepts the military's action rather than trying to reverse it. This pattern works because of the nature of the British system of government. The Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence are busy. They have many things to deal with. They do not have time to respond to every letter from the military. They delegate authority to military professionals. They trust military professionals to make decisions. And when the military makes a decision and presents it as a recommendation, the civilian leadership often simply accepts it. The military, understanding this, frames its decisions as recommendations. The military explains its reasoning. The military presents the options, and the military implements the decision unless explicitly prevented. The absence of a response to the letter from the Ministry of Defence about the SAS withdrawal from Northern Ireland is therefore not an accident. It is not an oversight. It is the normal practice of governance in the British state. The military makes a recommendation. The civilian leadership does not respond. The military proceeds. The decision is implemented. The civilian leadership can always say later that the military acted on its own authority. The civilian leadership can always claim that the military did not seek approval, but the civilian leadership chose not to respond to the letter. The civilian leadership chose not to intervene. The civilian leadership chose to allow the military to proceed. This is the significance of the 34-page letter from the Ministry of Defence and the absence of a response from the Secretary of State. It is not a dramatic moment in British political history. It is not a coup. It is not a challenge to civilian authority, but it is a moment that reveals something about how power actually works in the British state. It reveals that military organizations can exercise authority within the system of civilian control. It reveals that silence can be a form of authorization. It reveals that the actual structure of power is more complicated than the formal structure suggests. What happened to the SAS in Northern Ireland after 2004 was that it was no longer operating in Northern Ireland. The operation had been concluded. The presence had been ended. The personnel had been transferred. The operation in Northern Ireland, which had lasted for more than 30 years, was finished. It ended not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet wind-down. It ended because the military had decided that it was time to end it. It ended because the military had presented that decision to the civilian leadership. And it ended because the civilian leadership did not respond. The silence of the Secretary of State authorized the military to proceed, and the military proceeded accordingly. The practical implications of this mode of governance are significant. It means that the military can often achieve what it wants without explicit authorization from the civilian leadership. It means that military decisions can be implemented without formal political approval. It means that the civilian leadership can claim deniability. The military made the decision. The military acted on its professional judgment. The civilian leadership did not explicitly approve, but did not prevent the action. This system works when there is broad agreement between the military and the civilian leadership about what needs to be done. In the case of the SAS withdrawal from Northern Ireland, there was likely broad agreement. The peace process was holding, the security situation was improving, military force was becoming less relevant. Both the military and the civilian leadership understood that resources needed to be redeployed to other theatres. So the letter from the Ministry of Defence did not receive a response because there was no disagreement about what needed to be done. Everyone understood what the outcome should be. In 2004, the civilian leadership approved of the SAS withdrawal from Northern Ireland Island implicitly. The civilian leadership did not write a letter saying the SAS should stay. The civilian leadership simply accepted that the withdrawal would happen. The silence of the Secretary of State was a form of approval. It was approval by inaction. It was the normal way the system functioned. This is the way that power actually works within the British state. It is not the way that it is described in civics books. It is not the way that the Constitution describes the relationship between civilian and military authority. But it is the way that it actually functions. Power is exercised not only through explicit decision-making, but through implicit acceptance. Authority is maintained not only through explicit approval, but through the absence of disapproval. Control is exercised not only through command, but through the tolerance of military action. The letter from the Ministry of Defense sits in the archives marked classified. It has never been published. It has never been publicly debated. The civilian leadership never wrote a response. The matter was never formally discussed in Parliament. The SAS withdrawal from Northern Ireland never became a political issue. The operation simply ended. The decision was made by the military. The civilian leadership accepted it through silence, and the matter was closed. What this reveals is that the relationship between civilian authority and military authority is not as clear-cut as formal theory suggests. The military is not simply an instrument of civilian authority that carries out orders. The military is an independent organization with its own judgment, its own interests, and its own authority. The military makes decisions. The civilian leadership makes decisions. When the two disagree, there is a process for resolving the disagreement. But when the two agree, the military decision is implemented quickly. When the civilian leadership is silent, the military decision is implemented immediately. The significance of the unanswered letter from the Ministry of Defense is not that it represents a coup or a challenge to civilian authority. It is not evidence of military insubordination. It is evidence of the actual way that governance works within the British state. It is evidence that authority is more diffuse than formal theory suggests. It is evidence that the military can exercise authority within the system of civilian control. It is evidence that silence can be a form of authorization. The pattern that emerged from the SAS withdrawal from Northern Ireland is a pattern that has repeated itself many times in the history of British military operations. When the military wants to do something and presents its case to the civilian leadership, the civilian leadership often accepts the military's recommendation through inaction. The military proposes. The civilian leadership does not respond. The military proceeds. The decision is implemented, and the relationship between civilian and military authority is maintained, even though power has effectively shifted in favor of the military. This is the real significance of the 34-page letter from the Ministry of Defense and the complete absence of any response from the Secretary of State. It is not a dramatic moment. It is not a constitutional crisis, but it is a moment that reveals something important about how power actually works within the British state. It is a moment that reveals that the relationship between civilian and military authority is more fluid and more complex than formal theory suggests. It is a moment that reveals that authority can be exercised through silence.